moderator for today's program will be Sam Richardson, who is the Director of Operations at PCFR, and our speaker is Margaret Myers. To tell you a little bit about our speaker today, Margaret Myers is the Director of the Asia and Latin American Program at the Inter-American Dialogue, focusing on China's growing presence in Latin America. She established the China and Latin America Working Group and created the China-Latin American Finance Database. Myers has authored various publications on topics such as Chinese leadership dynamics, international capital flows, and Asia-Latin American relationships. She has testified before U.S. government committees and is a frequent commentator in major media. Prior to her current role, she worked for the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Navy. Myers also holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia and has received several prestigious fellowships for her research on China-Latin American relationships. Please please join me in welcoming Margaret Myers.
Well, thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and also to PCFR for the invitation. It's really such a pleasure to be here. This is an expansive topic, one that, obviously looks at the nexus, the interaction between China, which in itself is very complex, right? And then the entirety of the Latin American and Caribbean region, which, as you all know, is exceedingly diverse. And so there is so much to talk about as concerns this relationship. What I thought I would do today in my limited time is to kind of give you a sense of how this relationship has evolved over the past 2.5 decades. What has motivated China over this period of time to engage with Latin America and with other regions for that matter, and how maybe some of those motivations are changing and some of this activity is shifting, and then what can we expect looking ahead. I'll focus a lot on the economic and strategic elements of this, China's own strategy in the region and globally, but there's a lot more to talk about too, right? The Taiwan relationship, right? Some other China's diplomatic engagement, what that looks like, military to military interaction, engagement with specific countries. So I really look forward to your questions. Please, don't hesitate to ask whatever you'd like, and I'll do my very best to answer those questions and to delve deeper into areas that are of specific interest to each of you. And thank you for being here and joining me for this conversation. I'm going to upload a presentation and then get started. So hopefully you can all see this. Let me put it in presentation mode. So just to start out, thank you, Sam. Just to start out, in my classes, right, and just in general in a lot of presentations, I tend to break up the China-Latin America relationship into 3, 4, sometimes 5 distinct phases, right? It has changed over time in really particular ways. There are a lot of ways to break this up, but this is sort of my favorite characterization of the evolution of the relationship. It's important to note that the China-Latin America relationship is not a new thing, right? This has been going on for decades upon decades, even centuries in certain cases. There are books, if you're interested, about China-Peru engagement back even in the 1700s. But the China-Latin America relationship, as we understand it, right, this enhanced period of economic and political activity really started around the early to mid 1990s. So just about a decade and a half ago. I guess we're getting closer to 3 decades ago right now. And at this point in time, it was majorly sort of driven by what are called state-owned enterprises, right? So China's own state companies, which were interested more than anything in acquiring resources, right? Look, they were going to certain parts of the region to seek out copper on the one hand, and so Peru was a top destination for these companies early on, and then also oil, and so you can imagine that countries like Venezuela initially, and then later Ecuador, were primary destinations for for China's oil companies, national oil companies as they're called, CNPC, Sinopec, CNOOC, these names which you may have heard of at some point in time. The vast majority of what Chinese state-owned enterprises and other companies were doing during this first phase from, the mid-1990s to around 2013 was driven by something called the going out strategy. And those of us who look at China-Latin America relations in any depth tend to hear about this a little bit too much, right? The going out strategy is a term that's referenced extensively in the literature on this topic. The strategy itself has three tenets, three major objectives. The first is resource seeking, and we talked about that already. China is very interested and has been for a long time in oil, as I mentioned, in minerals. Used to be copper, still is copper, but then also a wide range of other minerals, critical minerals, lithium, right, cobalt, other things with technological applications are of considerable importance to China right now, but also soy. Soy is a very, very big driver of China's relationship with especially South America and especially Brazil. Why does China want soy? It's not for soy-based products like tofu, for example, for humans, right? It's for animal feed. As more and more Chinese are eating meat, as China's middle class grows and palates expand to encompass a much wider range of foods. And this growth in soy, demand for soy, is expected to continue way into the 2040s and even potentially beyond. So Latin America factors very prominently in this respect. The second tenet of the going out strategy is related to market-seeking activity, finding markets for Chinese exports. This used to mean low value-added exports, right? Shoes, textiles, toys, things of this nature. It still is to a degree, right? But now we're also talking about a very wide range of very high value, very high-tech, innovation-related exports and services. So that means what? Lenovo computers, Huawei handsets, artificial intelligence applications, cloud computing, data centers, high-speed rail, ultra-high voltage transmission lines, really, you name it, right? These are the things now that China is seeking markets for across the entirety of the region. And the third tenet is, the internationalization, as it's called, of Chinese companies, making them competitive in the region. Back in the 1990s and early 2000s, this was very hard for China. China did not have a particularly sound understanding of the region and its investment environments, of differences among different countries, right? Whether from a cultural or historical or even economic and regulatory perspective. There were no real networks of contacts and very little in the way of lobbying capability, right, that China had in these places. So what did China do at this juncture to help its companies to establish a presence? Well, it issued what were called at the time and continue to be called tied loans. So big banks like the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank, some of the biggest in the world, issued very large loans, usually in billions, right, to governments in the region, very specific governments in the region. And they did so for infrastructure projects that were sometimes identified by the governments themselves, sometimes by Chinese companies, but which involved the use of Chinese companies. They were tied to the use of Chinese companies and the importation of Chinese equipment. Maybe it would be rail equipment or construction equipment, things of this nature. So that helped to ensure that Chinese equipment found its way into these markets, but also that Chinese companies had the opportunity to operate on the ground in places where they might not always otherwise be competitive. They were competing with companies that had been there for decades, if not centuries in certain cases. And this was a very effective way to establish an initial presence in Latin America, and indeed, helped many companies to do so during this initial period. This activity started growing, as I mentioned, in the mid-1990s and early 2000s, but it really took off after the global financial crisis in 2008. This is because a lot of the traditional traders and investors were exiting the region at this point in time, finding it too difficult to operate in what was a very difficult economic period. Many of them divested, many of them abandoned their Latin America portfolios. And trade essentially doubled during this time, or if not tripled in certain instances, right? And then we saw an absolute surge in especially Chinese mergers and acquisitions. So purchasing companies as other international firms, be they American or Canadian or European or even firms from the region, left Latin America. And so we saw, a huge jump in overall Chinese ownership of assets following the 2008 crisis. Let's move on to, let me see if I can, there we go, to the second phase. And the second phase, in my view, at least in my characterization, starts around 2013. 2013 is a really important year in Chinese history for a number of different reasons, right? One, I wish I were there with you so I could ask you what you believe they are. But, one of these was that this was kind of the end of the commodity boom cycle, right? It was a time when the commodity booms essentially, drove a lot of China's initial investment in the region. But it busted essentially in 2013, and we saw dropping prices, international prices, global prices for commodities. So that was one important feature. Another is that Xi Jinping became the sort of, paramount ruler of China, head of the military, head of the party, president of China in 2013. And she has adopted a very different approach to foreign policy. It's described by many as much more assertive, of reclaiming China's position in the global order, of at least being very focused on that particular element, right, of China's outreach. So a shift in thinking about China, its global standing, and how China ought to interact with the US and indeed with countries across the globe. Another really important thing started in 2013, and that was what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. And if anyone has any questions about the Belt and Road Initiative and what that is and how it started, I'd be delighted to answer those. But essentially, it's Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy initiative. It's largely an global infrastructure initiative. It started in its incipient, very limited form in 2013 and has since expanded to be a global initiative. So I would say probably the fourth thing, and I want to talk about this in a little bit more depth, was that at this exact same time, we saw China experimenting with a process sort of already underway, but it was an effort to address what China has identified as major structural problems in its economic growth strategy, noting that if it does not essentially rework its economy in really critical ways, both addressing, demographic challenges, structural economic challenges, social issues, these things do not happen, then it will not grow. And indeed, we're seeing some of the ramifications of not having addressed some of these things already, right, as we see slowing growth in China. But it will not grow at moderate rates into the future. And it was aiming for 5% back then. It's not really achieving 5% right now, right? So the writing was on the wall, so to speak, in 2013 and even beforehand, right? So China recognized that this was critical and that things needed to be done. So what is all of this? What is all of this, and what does especially, the reform agenda have to do with Latin America? Well, let me show you if this will work. Let's see, there we go. This is a map that we put together not all that long ago. Well, I guess it has been a little while now. In 2018, I need to update it urgently, I guess. But we put it together in 2018. These are projects, transport infrastructure projects. So there are a lot of infrastructure projects that China's been doing in Latin America for many years, including in the energy realm, right? But these are transport infrastructure projects. The light blue are projects that at the time, at least in 2018, were being considered. Maybe there was a memorandum of understanding or some sort of initial feasibility study. They were being talked about in some seriousness, right, at the bilateral level. The dark blue projects are projects where either they were operational already, right, or there was at least a shovel in the ground. They were being constructed in some form in 2018. The one I want to talk about is this one. This has not been developed for a lot of different reasons, many of them political in nature. It's called the Peru-Brazil Railway for obvious reasons, right? Running from Peru to Brazil. It's also called the Transoceanic Railway. And it is, or the Bioceanic Railway is another, Twin Ocean Railway, Transoceanic and Bioceanic Railway, a lot of different names. There were also 3 different routes that were proposed here, right? This was the one that China favored the most, which went from Peru through Bolivia to Brazil. This is a monumental project, monumental undertaking, right? It was anticipated to cost about $50 billion, probably would be double that when all would be said and done, right? It's also difficult because it runs through 3 countries with very different specifications for rail development, which would have to be accounted for across every border. It traverses uncontacted populations, right? So those that live deep in the jungle and are not in contact in general with society. It also traverses majorly biodiverse areas. So the sort of resistance that China would encounter to doing this sort of thing, not to mention the cost, would be extensive. So why in the world would China want to pursue a project like this? And I'd argue that they would for a lot of reasons, many of which are related to their own domestic interests, right? And their own domestic reform agenda. So first of all, we talked a lot about China's skyrocketing demand for soy. This is a region, I don't know if my cursor is working here, hopefully you all can see it. This is a region called Mato Grosso, which is one of the largest soy producing regions in the world. And so part of the rationale behind this railway would be to carry this soy from Mato Grosso all the way over to Peru for transport this direction to China, in addition to wide-ranging other raw materials or primary commodities. Why would China want to go this way instead of this way? I mean, all of this is about developing alternatives, first of all, to the Panama Canal, right? In the event that there were some sort of obstruction of the free flow of goods through the Panama Canal. So alternatives are important. But this way is important also because you're not going through the Gulf of Aden. You're not going through the South China Sea, just, potential choke points, for example, where there's a lot of contested territories, right, waters, and then also not through the Taiwan Strait, where, as we all know, there could be some sort of military contingency in the coming years. So this is an important trade route. There's a trade security dimension to some of this. What else? Well, for a project of this scale, $50 billion or more, right, there are only a handful of banks in the world that could do anything like this, right? So China Development Bank is one of those. And as we heard earlier, right, China Development Bank has tended to issue tied loans. So for giving finance, but requiring that the importation of Chinese equipment and the use of Chinese companies. So this is a matter of addressing, right, the export-related interest that China has in the region. I'm going to plug in my computer very quickly, apologies, while also ensuring that Chinese companies, especially construction companies, have opportunities in Latin America and other parts of the world. Chinese infrastructure and construction companies are running out of opportunities at home. There are more things they can do. In fact, they've been given a mandate to do so just this past week. But they also need to be engaging in the global south and beyond, right, to continue earning money and growing their portfolios. So these are all critical components of achieving, of addressing China's excess capacity in labor in particular, and services. China's loans also happen to sometimes be denominated in renminbi. Renminbi is China's currency. It's also known as the yuan. And as we saw during the BRICS summit, right, the use of the internationalization of China's currency is something that China has been trying to achieve through its financial reforms for many, many years. So this is something that China sometimes does to help to encourage the circulation of its own currency, and indeed would do in this particular context. A rail project of this sort would also most certainly use Chinese steel. And this is extremely important to China, and this is why we see so many rail projects across the globe, because China's steel sector is state-run and it has extensive inefficiencies and a lot of overcapacity. And so exporting that overcapacity is a big reason why China is so engaged in projects of this sort, and especially steel, steel-related projects, things like rail and other construction that involves steel in whatever form. This would also, from a diplomatic perspective, if China were able to achieve this, be a major boon, especially given that a lot of companies have tried to build cross-cutting, cross-regional infrastructure in the past, and you can see the skeletons of those projects sort of scattered throughout this region, given that they did not succeed in most all cases. So as you can see, there is a very clear alignment between what China is doing overseas, right, and what China is trying to achieve at home. And so it is absolutely no, I'll go to that in a second, but it's absolutely no coincidence, right, that the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an infrastructure-driven but also broader connectivity-enhancing initiative, also started around this time, right? This was a major motivating factor for so much of what China was doing globally at that particular moment. In addition, as I mentioned, there's a lot of kinds of infrastructure that are out there, right? Not just transport infrastructure. There's also energy infrastructure. That includes energy generation through renewables, through hydroelectric projects, through other sources of energy, and also transmission and distribution, right? So China has been investing very heavily in all of this all over the region. I wrote a piece recently called "It's Electric," because indeed it is right now. This is the big focus of so much of what China is trying to do at the moment. This is the geographical distribution of plants and installed capacity in Brazil alone. And you can see that in Sao Paulo state, which happens to have a very strong relationship with China, you can see 7,907 megawatts, right, of installed capacity. And then in terms of plants, 304 plants, 304 total, 57 plants here too. This is another really important region in which China has engaged over time, where there are a lot of projects that China is exploring, including in the hydrogen and other renewable energy sectors. So there's a lot of activity here as well. And so, as I mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative coming around in 2013 was no coincidence. This is a map dating back to 2018 again and needs to be updated. You can see that in 2018, these are the blue countries, are countries that signed on to the China's Belt and Road Initiative. How do you sign on to a Belt and Road Initiative? Basically, what you do is to sign a memorandum of understanding. It's non-binding. It's largely symbolic, right? And a demonstration of support for Xi's agenda. But it stipulates a number of areas in which these countries will plan to work with China, right? Many of them are areas that China has identified as top priorities for itself. These were the ones, the blue ones, right, that had signed in 2018. And these, you can see Latin America was a bit more distant, a bit of a holdout. It wasn't clear for a very long time whether Latin America was even part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It was supposed to initially be a Silk Road initiative, and obviously Latin America doesn't fall neatly within that categorization. So it took a little while, right? But we've seen some new additions. We have seen Argentina join the Belt and Road. So this would be blue now, a much more blue South America map, right? We've also seen Honduras and Nicaragua join because they cut ties with Taiwan. They had originally been diplomatic allies of Taiwan and not of China. And when they cut ties, they signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative too. Some interesting holdouts too, though. Brazil, even under Lula, right? And also Colombia, even under Petro. And Petro just went to Beijing last week and also didn't agree to sign on to the BRI. Paraguay is a holdout because it too is a country that has diplomatic ties with Taiwan. So finally, let's move on to the third phase. The third phase here it essentially aligns or corresponds with the region's formal inclusion in the Belt and Road Initiative. So as I said, it wasn't a natural part of this sort of concept early on, right? This Silk Road route concept. But as a result of a lot of lobbying, mostly on the part of Latin American representatives, there was an eventual decision by China to formally extend the Belt and Road Initiative to Latin America. And they did so during what's called the China-LAC Forum, which is a forum that China has set up in the Latin American region to communicate its own policy priorities and work with Latin American governments. So 2018 was when everyone was welcome to formally participate in the initiative. Panama is the outlier. It signed on in 2017 before all of this happened. So what's different about this phase? Not a whole lot. We're still seeing the three tenets of the of the going out strategy, resource seeking, market seeking, internationalizing, strengthening Chinese companies' positions in the region, guiding so much of what's happening, albeit in a wider range of sectors, right? We still see China's own domestic interests shaping everything that's happening in Latin America and indeed globally. What did change during this phase is that we saw essentially an explosion of activity at the local level. We saw a localization of activity, a lot more actors working across the board to make things happen from a commercial and both a political perspective in wide-ranging parts of the region. This corresponded obviously with pandemic-related engagement, right? There was a lot of there are a lot of efforts on the part of Chinese companies and others on the ground to work at the local level to make things happen in terms of pandemic assistance. But this also extended to other areas as well. So a lot happening there, and also in the digital space. Digital Silk Road came about as as a sort of was re-emphasized during this period. So a lot more happening then. Just to give you a little bit of an understanding of how China views its partnerships in the region, and continues to. This also needs a slight update. The dark green here these are China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs categorizations of the sorts of partnerships that it has in the region. The darker the green, the stronger the partnership. And so you can see a lot of the dark green is either in really big countries, right? Or it's in countries in South America. What does it mean to have a very strong partnership with China? We're not sure because there's not a clear definition of this, but essentially what we believe that it means is that there is cooperation across a wide range of areas, right? Obviously in the economic realm, but also in terms of policy coordination, both, investment policy, but also maybe policy coordination in international organizations on standard setting, for example, and other issues. Military mill-to-mill cooperation in various forms, right, is a big part of this. Media cooperation and cooperation within civil society, really, you name it, right? There are a lot of different ways that the countries can cooperate, and so the more cooperation, the stronger the partnership. During Petro's visit to China last week, this partnership here in Colombia was upgraded to the same level as Bolivia. So now both have a strategic partnership. As opposed to, what was it? Normal diplomatic relations is what Colombia had before, right? The countries that have recently cut ties with Taiwan also now have normal diplomatic relations, obviously. And Venezuela has a new categorization, something about being all-weather friends. I never remember the exact, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but inevitably it suggests that Venezuela relationship has gone through its ups and downs, and that China is there regardless of what happens in the Venezuela context. There are a few also that have special characterizations, obviously Cuba, good brother, good comrade, good friend, reflective of the longstanding historical and ideologically based ties that these two countries have. And then Trinidad has one too, and I'm not entirely sure why, but it has its own categorization as well. So what's happening now? Are we going toward a fourth phase in the relationship? I believe we are. And I think this is driven, or we see sort of three clear trends, right? Let's see, I want to make sure I'm not running too far over time. Yeah, I should stop in just a second. I'll stop with this. So what's happening? What are the main trends that we're seeing? First of all, a tapering, a focusing, and a localizing. So what do I mean by this? Economically speaking, in Latin America right now, we are seeing a tapering in overall economic activity. And this makes sense given what's happening in China, right? China's growth is slowing. China has less capital to bring to bear internationally. Still has a lot, right? So there's still things being done, but it's less, and it has to be controlled more strictly. What does this tapering look like? Well, it's not happening in trade. Trade is booming and continues to underpin the relationship regardless, right? However, in investment, we're seeing a sort of, it's not dropping. It's going a little bit more like this, right? So slower overall growth year on year in trade, in investment, whether it's greenfield, new projects, right, or acquisitions, buying existing projects. And then finance is where we really see the drop. Since 2015, we've seen just an absolute decline in Chinese finance to the region, especially coming from the policy banks that I talked about before, China Development Bank and China Exim Bank. This tapering is related to a focusing. So China is no longer as focused as it has been in the past on large-scale infrastructure, right? There are still ports being developed. There are still railways and other things that are happening. A lot of those were negotiated, though, 5-6 years ago in certain cases, right? We're not seeing a lot of new major infrastructure projects. What we are seeing are more projects, but in smaller sectors, smaller industries, or industries where the deals themselves are smaller. So the focus right now is on what China calls new infrastructure. New infrastructure, as defined by China, is everything tech and innovation. Why the focus on new infrastructure? Because these are the sectors that China must compete in, must be dominant in, if it is going to grow at the rates that it needs to grow at to become a higher income, upper income country of the likes of Japan, Europe, United States, South Korea even. Otherwise, it will be stuck at a middle income level and not be able to continue growing and struggle with structural economic problems for many, many years to come, right? So this is a critical, fundamental, existential challenge for China. And where can it invest in tech? Not in the global north, because there are a lot of impediments. There are a lot of challenges right now legally to investing as a tech company in the US, for example. So where is China going? China's going to Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, wide-ranging other places to make all of this happen. So we're focusing. The numbers are down not because there are fewer projects, there are more, but they're smaller. And then finally, a localizing. It's not just bilateral deal making that we're seeing right now. It's not president to president, right? It's Chinese companies going to provinces, to states, to municipalities, these are sometimes capital cities, sometimes they're cities or towns of 200,000 people, where there are strategic resources, or where a specific infrastructure project will achieve a lot for China or a certain Chinese company. And this is, where we see so much of the activity taking place at this particular juncture. I have a lot of slides that I could show you later or share with you through Sam, but I'll stop right here and turn to your questions. And thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And this was so helpful and very eye-opening. And we have a lot of good questions in the chat, but as the moderator, I'd like to ask my question first. And so I guess it's just a question about the US-China competition. And so given that competition, how do you envision the evolving global political dynamics impacting Latin America's strategic position? Especially in the context of economics, global trade, immigration. How's that relationship affect Latin America?
Yeah, it's interesting. During the Obama era, there was a sort of general, at least rhetorically speaking, right? There was this sense that what was good for Latin America, was good for the US too, right? And many viewed sort of Chinese investment in certain sectors in Latin America as being good for Latin America, and therefore, good for the hemisphere as a whole, and overall, promoting of overall engagement or well-being. Obviously, that is not sort of how the U.S. Views Chinese engagement in Latin America now. There has been a fundamental change in thinking about all of this. So what does this mean for Latin America? Well, this sense, and I think it's two-sided, right? Of competition, almost zero-sum competition, right, on the part of China and the U.S. has put Latin American countries in a position of feeling, at the very least, that they need to navigate this reality. Whether they do or not, I think, is another question, and really depends on the country that we're talking about, right? But there have been instances where countries have had to make a decision, facing pressure, frankly, from both sides. One, very prominent example regards a Trans-Pacific undersea cable, right, that was going to extend from Chile across the Pacific, and there were several routes proposed. The U.S. pushed very hard for one of the routes to go through Australia, because Australia has a ban on the use of Huawei technology. And Huawei was one of the companies that was going to be presumably doing the cable, right? Instead, Chile chose, instead of the other routes, it chose the Australia route, and therefore a Japanese company, NEC, won the bid. But you see a little bit of jostling here and there. They're still limited, right? The examples are still limited. But there is a sense, I think, an innate sense, whether it's direct or indirect, right, of a sort of pressure and of always having to think about both sides and what their interests might be, and whether, U.S. This pressure will affect the extent to which these countries can derive some benefit from Chinese investment in some of these sectors. What the issue, right, is that the U.S. has been very vocal about a lot of what China is doing in the region, and many in the region are receptive to what the U.S. has to say, or at least are interested in this information. At the same time, the U.S. has been less forthcoming than China with finance, with actual capital to make things happen in sectors of interest, be it infrastructure or digital transformation or energy transition, or all of these issues, right, that are of top priority to Latin America. And so until those funds can materialize, the decisions will be largely economic in nature.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah, that's very interesting. And so kind of going on. So next question. This is from Casey Douglas, one of our members. And this, she says, is there any, or can you discuss the Chinese immigration in the region in order to work on these infrastructure projects?
Mm-hmm.
And I might add, especially in this new phase 4, where they're potentially tapering off a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really critical question. So, there was a period in time when there were a lot of Chinese workers coming to the region. This is something that China, as I mentioned, there are major issues in excess capacity, right, in China, whether we're talking about steel or we're talking about services, right, construction services, or we're talking about labor. Exporting labor is a really important thing for China as it tries to ensure that everybody is doing some work, right, and there's work to be had. And so this has been part of contract negotiations in a lot of different places and for a lot of different projects. The extent to which countries allow this to happen depends on, the extent to which they feel they are in a position to negotiate effectively to ensure that it does not. So, if you are a smaller country and you really need a project and you don't feel you have much leverage at the bargaining table, you may be willing to allow 4,000 Chinese workers to come to your island, as this has been the case, for example, with Bahamar, the Bahamar Hotel construction many years ago in Bahamas, right? If it's Brazil, there's not that same feeling, and and the construction, the projects that have taken place in Brazil are beholden to Brazil's local content stipulations. Not a lot of importation of Chinese equipment, not use of Chinese labor. And so it really, really varies on a country by country basis. In a lot of cases, now there's also a lot of pushback, a lot of negative press, a lot of reputational risk associated with bringing a lot of workers right to the region. And China's recognized this and has drawn down a bit on these, on at least the numbers of folks that are coming to do some of this work. That's not to say that it's not happening. There are plenty of workers on the Chancay port right now, and Chinese workers on the Chancay port right now in Peru, and that accompany, mining companies when they head to the region. Many of them are at the administrative level and not doing sort of more labor-intensive work. But nevertheless, so it's a shifting sort of dynamic, right? Ever shifting, and it really does depend on what we do see in terms of immigration. I mean, there's a real sort of relaxed visa process for Chinese workers going into Ecuador, and so a lot of, as I understand it, and there are really great reports written about this that I have not written, so I'd encourage you to take a look at those. But we'll then go from there to through same channels, right? They can fly or go over land, sometimes to Mexico, sometimes to the United States, or elsewhere. But there has been a degree of migration, right, associated with workers and others coming to parts of Latin America and then journeying elsewhere. I wish I knew the numbers for you, but it strikes me as a sort of ever evolving dynamic.
Awesome. Interesting. That is very interesting. So kind of going off of that and the Belt and Road Initiative, we have two questions kind of about that. So my first one it's from Arnolfo, and he says, how risky, so a lot of times reports are that China uses predatory loans for Belt and Road Initiatives to gain assets. And so Arnolfo asks, how risky can BRI loans be to poor Latin American countries? And have you seen that happen where China claims parts of ports or something?
In the Latin American context, there is no evidence of China extending loans with the express interest in what, assuming that these loans will default, right? There will be a default on these loans, and then that China will be able to secure strategic access to certain assets, right? So instead, what we've seen is kind of the opposite, right? You've seen a lot of instances where maybe this could happen, right? And it has not. So what China has generally done in almost all the countries in Latin America is to, so far at least, right, try to work with these countries to either change the conditions of some of these loans, right, like extend, sometimes reducing the overall amount that's owed, changing interest rates, extending the life of the loan, doing certain things to make it a little bit more feasible for these countries to pay back in the longer term. In some cases, this is just kicking the can down the road, right? It's not going to make a fundamental difference in their ability to pay things back. And eventually something is going to hit the fan, right? And there's going to be a reckoning. And much will depend on what happens then, right? But the countries right now, they're just a handful, right, that are really struggling as concerns their Chinese debt. Venezuela obviously is one of them. It's been consistently paying off its debt. It had 60 billion. Now it's down to somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 billion. We'll see, how and whether they'll be able to pay this remaining amount off, and at what rate. Ecuador too, it went through a renegotiation last year, which bought them some time and breathing room. But again, these problems are not gone. Argentina is another, and it's had trouble. It's in an economic crisis at the moment, right? Even as it goes into the election, and then is in difficulties with the IMF and with China alike. And then there's, of course, a number of countries in the Caribbean where, in my view, at least, this is looking, a little bit more challenging than Dominica is one where, there's going to be a reckoning fairly soon. And so part of the issue, China's not the major lender to these countries. There's Venezuela aside, right? A lot of the debt is not Chinese. The problem is that the Chinese debt is coming due all sort of at once on top of all the other obligations, right, that these countries have. And so then what do they do? It was also extended at a moment when these countries were already not in a great position from a debt to GDP perspective, right? They were already very overloaded in certain cases with debt. So it was a timing issue that made it very, very problematic. And then also the other major issue with this is, not to say that this is not a problem, right? The other major issue with this is that China has not typically wanted to work with what's called the Paris Club of lenders, right? The other lenders, to coordinate on a restructuring of the debt. So when a country goes into crisis, all of these other countries are trying to work together to figure out how they're going to manage it, with nobody really calling on the debt all at once, right? China stands aside and has not been particularly willing. In some cases it has, in some cases it hasn't, right? But willing to work with these other lenders to find a common solution. And that for many has been exceedingly frustrating.
Yeah. Okay, so that's really eye-opening. So kind of another aspect of that question, this comes from Greg. Are the Chinese using these infrastructure projects to establish military installations, or are they offering Chinese surveillance technology to governments to enable monitoring populations? Are they doing any of that in Latin America?
So on the surveillance technologies, yes, absolutely. Chinese surveillance technologies are being, sold often to cities or provinces or states, right, across the region, often at a very low rate, low cost. A lot of these products are subsidized. That includes in ICT and in wide-ranging other, high-tech sectors, also renewable energy infrastructure. So yes, they're being employed. What's notable though is there are real differences in the kinds of things, right, that are what is surveillance technology, right? Some of it is just, like you're in a park and you hit a blue box and because you see something scary and it calls somebody, right? In other cases, there are these integrated systems, right, where there's a central command center, which then has monitoring capacity across much of the country, and nobody really knows who's controlling it or who has access to the data, and is it being, so that there's a system like that in Ecuador that has been of concern to many. There is a system in Venezuela that more or less replicates some of the elements of the Chinese system, right? So I believe it's Carnet de la Patria, right, is the name of that one. And it's got a sort of social credit element to it, right? So tracks all sorts of different metrics and then determines whether you're eligible for certain things based on whether you're a good citizen or not, right? And that's sort of similar to how China has been doing things. So it's a scale, right? It's a scale when we're talking about, and France and other countries are involved in surveillance technology provision as well. It's not like, it's just China doing these things, but the concerns are when it begins to impede on civil liberties. The Carnet de la Patria, as I understand it, hasn't worked as well as perhaps Venezuela had wanted, because some of the sort of supporting infrastructure, internet, interconnectivity is not there to help it happen, right? So, but yes, that's absolutely part of it. On military facilities, there are facilities in the south of or in Neuquén, right? In Argentina, there is I don't know if we call it a military facility or not, but it's in very large part by the People's Liberation Army, right? China's military. And it is a deep space observation facility. It was problematic from the onset because it was negotiated during the Christina Kirchner administration there was not a lot of, it was done very much behind closed doors without much understanding of what the conditions are and what the agreement was all about, whether there would be any Argentine access to it at all, even though it's on Argentine territory. There is, but it's small amount, right, in comparison to China's own access. And so it's a territorial and sovereignty issue as much as it is a military one. Another case, the basing, the dual use spacing. I mean, I don't know enough about that to know whether the dual use ports, presumable dual use ports, right, are in fact dual use or not capable, right? But certainly there are ports that are being developed that have very strong commercial rationale, and then there are ports that are being developed that have less commercial rationale, and so it's worth looking into at the very least, right?
Perfect. Awesome answer to that question. And so now we're going to shift to a little more like diplomatic questions for you. So the first one, kind of an overview, is how does the US footprint compare in relation to China's in Latin America, both diplomatically and economically?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question, because there is this sense that China is sort of overtaking the US in all respects, right, in Latin America, and that the you know, it's a done deal. This year the US was by far the largest investor and has for many years been. That said, a lot of that is skewed by Mexico, because so much of US investment goes to Mexico and not necessarily to South America or other parts of the region. So looking at it in aggregate doesn't always tell us the entire story. But it's still a critical investor, right? Has been there for a very long time. And when you look at US investment, it's in a much wider range of sectors than Chinese investment, for example, right? Which is fundamental from a development perspective. The US is also an important trade partner in the region, right? But that's where we are seeing a lot more activity from China, and a growing activity from China. And 10 years ago, you look at these maps, right? And where you have a flag where it's the top partner, right? It used to be a lot of US flags in the region. Now almost all of them are Chinese flags as top trade partner for these countries. And that's where, if you're talking influence, right, depending upon how things break down, if 90% of your top export, copper, for example, goes to China, I'm thinking of Chile, you're just simply not going to rock the boat all that much, right? And a lot of your investment on top of it, right? So there's, whether China exerts this influence or not, there's sort of an indirect influence that is inevitable, right? When there's that much economic engagement in one specific country as a share of GDP or otherwise, right? So that's a really important consideration. Diplomatically, the US is exceedingly engaged. Obviously, there are a lot of programs, there are a lot of projects, long-standing, so much happening, embassies all over the place, and then culturally, I mean, from a soft power cultural perspective, there's really no comparison. Also, people to people, the extent that that remittances play in development, and in so many of these US-based remittances, right, and so many of these countries, is absolutely fundamental for GDP growth across the region, and then just the cross-cultural ties with families based throughout the hemisphere. So those are all really important things. What I will say, though, is China is extremely adept at diplomatic activity too. And as I mentioned, is that activity is growing, and it's becoming increasingly dispersed and localized. And so what does that mean? It means that in many cases, you'll see a web of Chinese actors, maybe not operating in a coordinated fashion, but all operating sort of at once. So maybe it's universities, it's friendship networks, it's provincial sister cities or city provinces networks, right? There will be companies, there will be embassy officials, they're all kind of engaging all at once for 4 or 5, 10 years, right? Before a project is even in a sort of bidding cycle, so far upstream. And so as a US company, how are you going to compete with that, right? It's very hard to do. So when it comes time for the bidding process, a lot of these companies, or Chinese actors in general, are so well positioned, right, to then be able to engage, submit a bid that they know will be attractive to the various actors they've been engaging with for 10 years in certain cases, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And so we're short on time, but I think this is a really good question. So it is, can you explain more about Honduras's government shift of stance towards Taiwan and China? And is there any specific motive why China invests in Honduras? And I know you could teach a whole class on that, but you got 2 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, the countries in Central America, there's still a few who have not cut ties, right, with Taiwan yet, or established, and also in as I mentioned, Paraguay and a handful in the Caribbean. Honduras recently did, based on what many believe is the promise of more in the way of economic engagement. And what Honduras is looking for, I think, right now, especially, well, is first of all to deliver for its population, right? It wants to demonstrate that it can achieve things, this government, right, from an economic perspective, help ensure growth, help people to have better livelihoods, whatever it might be, right? And from China, they're looking for help with a handful of dams. Patuca, what is it? Yeah, Patuca Tres, right? Or is Patuca Tres or Atucha? I always forget those two. There's two different. Anyway, there's a handful of dams that they're looking to build out, and a few others as well, right? And then ideally a handful of other agreements too. The question now, so what is China? Is it interested? Why would it engage with Honduras? It's a really good question because will it? Will it do this or not? Will there be sort of, when you look at some of the other outcomes, like El Salvador, for example, cut ties, right? Panama stands apart. Panama, there was a ton of activity, but China's always been interested in Panama because it's super strategic.
Yeah.
But some of these others, it's not so much, right? And these are not easy investment environments. So how much will materialize actually is a really critical question. We may see something, it may be very token, or we may see actual support for one of these dam projects, but in general, it's not. I don't see a high degree of activity, especially at a moment when China is rethinking the BRI altogether and is operating with less capital and with a greater sense of risk, right? So this next year or two will be fundamental to understanding its approach to Honduras.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone for joining. I just want to say, if you guys are curious about learning more about this, I just Google Margaret Myers. She has the dialogue and she hosts a podcast, right?
So sometimes.
Sometimes there's a podcast.
I'm on podcast. We'll say it that way.
But there's a lot of resources. So I just encourage you to Google and search her, and she has a lot of good articles. But Margaret, thank you again so much for this. This has been really enlightening. And everyone, round of applause.
Thank you all. Thank you for the chance. I appreciate it.